I'm Gene Kuleta, editor of the Latin America Advisor at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted global supply chains. This comes as companies were already planning to move some of their sourcing and manufacturing out of China. The US trade war that began nearly 4 years ago increased concern about global supply chains involving China, and concern about the reliability of existing supply chains has only escalated amid the pandemic. This has led to more of a focus on nearshoring, moves by businesses to relocate operations to areas that are geographically closer. To examine these trends, we're joined by Tara Hariharan. She's Managing Director of Global Macro Research, and she joins us from New York. Thanks so much for being with us today, Tara.
Thank you, Gene, for the opportunity to discuss these issues today. I'm very excited to be a new member of the dialogue.
Wonderful. We're happy to have you. Now, relating to Latin America, when we discuss the topic of nearshoring, could you tell us a little bit about what the current trends are in nearshoring and how has the pandemic influenced those trends?
Absolutely. So basically, as you beautifully put it, nearshoring in this context refers to US companies shifting their trade and economic supply chains away from a currently high concentration in East Asia and China and moving to regions closer to home like Latin America. And we need to distinguish this from reshoring, which entails bringing supply chains directly back into the US. So even before the pandemic, nearshoring was an issue of interest, given that the economic tensions were developing between the US and China in the past few years. And the resultant urgency developed for the US to diversify its trade supply chains away from China. And we had started to see some evidence towards that effect. For instance, in 2019, there was a small but perceptible shift in the US buying more imports from LATAM at the expense of China due to the costly tariffs imposed by the US administration at the time on imports coming in from China. Also, many Latin American countries can offer much more productive and competitive labor costs than the US can at this stage. And LATAM also boasts a large labor pool, similar to what we can see in Southeast Asia, which has been a tremendous benefit to the supply chains there. And that is why nearshoring to LATAM could be seen as a very attractive preference to reshoring to the US. Now, at present, the realities of the pandemic have only underscored the need for less US reliance on Chinese and Asian supply chains. We can see that in the trade bottlenecks and shipping delays that the world is facing now, thanks to global disruptions from the COVID lockdowns. There's also a shortage going on for semiconductor chips for automobiles. And this chip production is also dominated by Asian manufacturers based half a world away from the US. Nearshoring could help ease some of these bottlenecks by reducing shipping distances and costs. There would be an added environmental benefit too. The distance between producer and consumer would be reduced, and maybe stricter green standards could be instituted for production that was based in the Americas rather than production based in China.
Now, could you give us a little bit more of an idea of the extent to which companies have already been thinking about moving their operations out of China and some other locations and into America, into the Americas? How much is this has already happened, and how much has this changed and gotten even stronger during the pandemic?
So as I mentioned before, we had been seeing even in 2019, the beginning of this shift of some US imports away from China as a source and preferring to buy from LATAM instead. But I have to say that the pandemic has made the trend much more murky and complicated. China has actually gained global export market share in 2020 and 2021, thanks to its economy being relatively unscathed by COVID, in contrast to the major disruptions we have seen in many other countries. There's also the fact that China's dominance is unrivaled in producing and exporting health-related goods like masks and personal protective equipment. So no one can really compete right now with Chinese manufacturing in terms of their economies of scale. And China is also benefiting from the strong supplier ecosystems based close by to them in Asia. Furthermore, the Chinese government is right now devoting a tremendous push to further improve its technological and supply chain competitiveness. And from my own engagement with US business and trade organizations, I do unfortunately hear that many US companies have been slow to shift their supply chains out of China because of this assumption of a continued and even growing Chinese manufacturing advantage over the rest of the world. I also wanted to mention a few other headwinds to the near-term outlook for reshoring to Latin America, in addition to this issue I mentioned of a very dominant China. For one, there's the trade and economic relationship between the US and Latin America facing some reality checks. For instance, if we look at the recently negotiated USMCA pact between the US, Mexico, and Canada, the US wants to address labor right issues in Mexico, and Mexico is wary of the US's insistence on a very high degree of North American content in automobiles produced in the region. So there are some of these differences of opinion that may take time for the integration of trade supply chains to be fully realized. And I just want to mention also at this juncture that Latin American countries have a lot of work to do on several factors to be able to better attract nearshoring opportunities. What is really needed in the region is political stability, pro-business policies that support public-private partnerships, and also addressing security concerns in regions like the Northern Triangle. We additionally need to see more investment in LATAM in infrastructure and in education to boost the skilled labor workforce. Furthermore, regional cooperation and trade integration across LATAM nations is essential at this stage so that LATAM can emulate and compete with those strong supplier ecosystems that I just mentioned that are present right now in China and in East Asia.
Sure. Now, when you talk about some of those policies that Latin American countries need in order to attract businesses to their shores, political stability and pro-business policies, does it seem that in the region, things are going in the direction in which countries may indeed attract more? Are more and more pro-business policies and is political stability improving, or are things going the other direction? Or is it more country by country? How do you see that situation?
So I do think that the future is getting brighter. While I am still cautious about how much in the near term Latin America can compete with China on economies of scale, it is clear that the US is paying attention to the reality of the US-China tensions and the lessons of the pandemic regarding trade delays and bottlenecks. And it is showing in terms of high-level discussions that the US is having regarding nearshoring. For instance, it's encouraging that last week, the US and Mexico held a high-level economic dialogue, and among other issues, they discussed the relocation of value chains within North America and also integrating value chains with Central America. There is also a legislation that has been drafted by US Congressman Mark Green called the Latin American Nearshoring Act that would incentivize US companies to shift production and invest more in facilities in the Americas and the Caribbean instead of other locations abroad, including China. And I also think, close to the heart of the Inter-American dialogue, another important organization, the Inter-American Development Bank, is keenly focused right now on promoting nearshoring and public-private coordination towards this end. So it is my belief if LATAM can continue to work on the structural issues I mentioned above, which would be important for LATAM development regardless, such as stabilizing political climates and economic policies, providing more safety and security, and investing in regional integrated infrastructure and education, I do think the outlook for nearshoring in LATAM could be very positive in the coming decades.
And I'm wondering if there's any way that you could perhaps quantify just how positive that is and how important this could be to the economies of Latin America in terms of boosts to their GDP or some other metric. How important really is it, and how critical is this topic and this trend for Latin American economies?
Absolutely. So nearshoring cumulatively could be a hugely beneficial windfall for Latin American economies. We're talking about the ability to increase the region's exports on the order of several tens of billions of dollars a year. And if this happens, this could help reduce the heavy reliance of some Latin American economies like Mexico on their incoming remittances. Because then, instead of depending on non-residents for key inflows, the boost to Latin American household incomes would come internally from domestic manufacturing and export activity. There's also a possibility that LATAM benefits greatly from long-term US-China decoupling concerns, because it's possible that global companies decide to develop separate and parallel supply chains, one for the US and one for China. And this could doubly benefit LATAM countries because not only would US companies base more of their activity in the region, that is in Latin America, but also some Chinese and Asian manufacturers could invest and produce even more in Latin American factories so that they can service the US consumer market. And I just wanted to mention a few cases of specific countries and sectors that are poised to greatly benefit from reshoring. I think the key space in which LATAM can benefit from reshoring is in manufactured goods on the low to middle end of the value chain. And that includes a whole host of consumer goods and manufacturing machinery that the US is a big importer of. Several Latin American countries are quite well placed in these sectors. I'm thinking, for instance, of Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Panama, and Costa Rica, all already having close trade ties with the US and having well-entrenched traditional and technology infrastructure to be able to deal with nearshoring. And even on the services side, there's already quite strong demand for IT services outsourcing from the US to nations like Brazil and Argentina. And I think this trend should also continue as the nearshoring push increases.
Fascinating. Now, this is a topic I know we're going to be talking to you a lot more about in the future, not only in video interviews, but perhaps in Q&As in the Latin America Advisor too. But for now, Tara, I think we'll have to leave it there. That's about all the time we have for today. Tara Hariharan, Managing Director of Global Macro Research, joining us from New York. Thank you again, Tara. Really appreciate your time on this today.
Thank you so much, Gene, and thank you, everyone.
I'm Gene Kuleta, editor of the Latin America Advisor at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington.